good afternoon, and
Good evening.
welcome to R.W.A, Radicals with Age. My name is Jesse.
And my name is Pancho.
Today is September 20th. However, this episode is episode 6. We have not even recorded episode 5 as of today because episode 5 is going to be airing the Tuesday before the US presidential election. So we have an episode planned for that, but we want to wait a little bit closer to the election. And so we know that this episode will be airing the week after the election. And we thought that maybe, we're very political, the show's very political, the climate right now is very political because of this very, what's a good descriptor for the election? Monumental, important. I don't know. Do you have a good word for that? What's this election to you?
I would say this is the most important presidential election ever.
There you have it. So we thought,
Democracy is on the line.
right. So we thought it would be a good idea to change the pace a little bit. Give everybody a break from what will be a stressful election season. So we decided that we'd, change it up a little bit. And today's episode is entitled Goats. If you're not aware with the latest lingo, a goat is someone who is the greatest of all time. So we are both huge sports fans. So we decided we would do an episode and talk about and potentially argue about who our goats are in each sport. And I think we should get started because a goat is not only someone who is an incredible athlete, but also, since we have this theme and ethic of the show that we like to talk about and highlight individuals who are aligned with us with their thoughts about the system and love and optimism and all those great things. So I think if we start with boxing, we will have an opportunity to not just talk about sports, but politics and culture as well. And I would assume that we both agree that the greatest boxer of all time is Mike Tyson.
Seriously.
Not seriously, but I love Mike Tyson and just want to always give him a shout out because was a great
Mike,
boxer and is hilarious.
oh, he is both a great boxer and hilarious, and his record as a heavyweight boxer was pretty good. One of the difficult things in boxing to talk about goats is that you have different weight classifications. And so you couldn't compare, just to arbitrarily take an example, you couldn't compare Mike Tyson to Sugar Ray Leonard
Right.
or Roberto Duran because they're not in the same weight category. So to me, it makes sense to talk about the GOAT of boxing is to limit our conversation to heavyweights.
Yeah, I think it's the to quote Gordon Ramsay, the heavyweights is the Rolls Royce of boxing. Yes, of course, there's the featherweights and the light heavyweights and the middleweights and the welterweights, but yeah,
You
heavyweights
left
is
you
what everyone
left
cares
out you
about.
left out the bantamweights.
That's the women, right?
No, there's men too, I think.
Okay.
It's all based on weight.
Right, but I think women are usually bantamweight, at least from like my very limited knowledge of MMA. Anyway, and I just wanted to say one more aside about Mike Tyson, which is like, we talk a lot about the evils of our capitalist system in this world, and I think there's really no greater example than Mike Tyson, this person who was so horribly treated as a child that he literally was friends with pigeons on his roof because he had nobody in his life. Just a really interesting example of desperation and stress hormones. And his reaction was to become the biggest, baddest dude he could so that nobody could ever hurt him again. So, anyway, just wanted to give that little shout out.
I'm okay with that shout out. I mean, one of my problems with talking about Mike Tyson. Yes, he was a great boxer. Yes, he had a horrible childhood. And yes, he could not find friends other than pigeons, and all that makes him a sympathetic figure. On the other hand, he was also guilty of incredible misogyny and beating his wife. And, you know, there's that whole conversation about, you know, art versus life. And, if somebody is a great artist, Picasso, but he treats the women in his life terribly, even though he makes great portraits of them, does that lessen Picasso's greatness as a painter?
I
And
think so.
that's, yeah. So for me, when I think of Mike Tyson, I think about seeing the interview with his ex-wife and how she talked about him beating her.
Yeah.
And it's hard to think of him as the GOAT given that.
Yes. Yeah. Even if he had a perfect record in the ring, he certainly wouldn't have had a perfect record in the social category, which I agree. I think in order to be the greatest of all time, there's sort of two metrics. There's your stats and contribution to your craft, to the sport. But yeah, then there's also the social thing. You can't be it's hard to say that you're the greatest of all time if you're horrible. Though I do think there's some people on my list that will unfortunately be so dominant in their sport that they get the GOAT title even though I don't want to give it to them.
That's what is going to make for an interesting conversation.
Agreed, agreed.
When I think of heavyweight boxers, I think of possible GOATs. I think of Mike Tyson. I think of Joe Louis, the
Mm.
Brown Bomber. I think of Jack Johnson, who, if you don't know, Miles Davis made a whole album
Mm,
dedicated to Jack Johnson.
I did not.
And then, of course, there's Muhammad.
There's
And
also Lennox Lewis, who has a great record. And speaking of great records, there's Rocky Marciano, who retired with a undefeated record.
undefeated record. That is true.
But yes, it's pretty clear, especially as we talked about the social impact that Muhammad Ali is has both of those categories pretty firmly in his grasp.
Jack Johnson was really socially important. He's boxing at the very early part of the 20th century, and they didn't allow black boxers to compete against
Mm,
white boxers. So the heavyweight champion had always been somebody who was white.
that's so crazy.
And so Jack Johnson came in and he whipped everybody's ass. And of course, the white world did not like that. He was arrested
Whoa.
because they used the Mann Act against him, which was he had a relationship with a white woman. They were in a car together and drove across state lines, and they somehow made that into a crime.
That's what and that was called the Mann Act?
Yeah.
Huh. I gotta look that up. I've never heard of that. Obviously, I know about all of the anti-miscegenation laws and stuff before Loving v. Virginia changed that, but I didn't realize that it was called the Mann
The
Act, or at least this example.
I believe that's the correct title. Two N's on man.
Mm.
So Jack Johnson was really important because he essentially broke the color code for boxing. And of course, that's where the term the Great White Hope came
Uh,
from. Because once Jack Johnson started kicking everybody's ass, white people didn't like that. And so they wanted to find somebody, a white person, who could beat Jack Johnson. And so various white people kept going into the ring and they all kept losing. As an aside, we recently lost the great voice of James Earl Jones.
Mm,
And there was a Broadway play about Jack Johnson called The Great White Hope, and James Earl Jones starred in it.
nice.
Great, great loss to the artistic world of James Earl Jones.
Absolutely. So,
So
are you making an argument for Jack Johnson, or just that he's an honorable mention among
I'm making
other greats?
an honorable mention.
Mm,
So he was not only a great boxer, but he was politically important because of the time when he was doing his thing.
yeah.
The same can be said of the Brown Bomber, Joe Louis, who was his most memorable fights were against Max Schmeling from Germany,
I was
and
gonna
that
say.
was during the time of Hitler. And so those boxing matches that they had were sort of politicized as the US against Nazi Germany.
Right.
And so when Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling, it was like euphoria in the United States
Yeah.
because that showed that we were bigger, better, and stronger than Nazi Germany.
And did
So
that happen before or after 36 Olympics, where we also
it was
kicked Germany's
it,
ass?
it was after,
Okay. So it's just
but
another instance
just
of Germany losing.
precisely. Joe Louis, after his boxing days were over, he he was kind of conservative and he did not
Hmm.
take a very public stand about things that were going on. I would put him also in the honorable mention category. We have Jack Johnson, we have Joe Louis, we have Mike Tyson, but I have to give my GOAT award to the person. I believe this is the person for whom the term GOAT was invented.
Interesting. I didn't know that. But
Yeah,
I'm not surprised.
there was a book that was put out, and the title of the book was GOAT,
Hmm.
and it was, of course, about Muhammad Ali.
Cassius
So
Clay.
Cassius Marcellus
Hmm.
Clay from
Nice.
Louisville, Kentucky.
Hmm.
So what I want to say about Ali is I think that he was the greatest heavyweight. He won the heavyweight championship 4 different times.
Right.
After losing it, he came back and won again. To me, he is the greatest. I also have to signally praise him for his civic duty in refusing to register for the draft in, I believe it was 1967. Now, his famous statement was, no Vietnamese ever called me nigger.
Right.
There was so much negative attention and publicity on him that he was banned from boxing for 4 years.
I didn't realize it was so long. Wow.
Yeah, which was in his prime,
Yeah.
in his 20s. So imagine how many more victories he would have won.
Right.
So there was negativity towards him because of his stance on the Vietnam War. There was negativity towards him because he changed his name and converted to Islam. And he had to undergo, he lost his livelihood.
Yeah.
He couldn't make any money. And that was for 4 years. And then, he had to finally, the Supreme Court overturned the ban on him being able to box. And then he had to beat a whole bunch of losers before he got to fight for the heavyweight championship again. And there
Wait,
was that.
you said the Supreme Court. You mean like a boxing court, or like it was actually
No,
like a whole?
the U.S. Supreme
Wow,
Court.
holy shit.
Then, after, working his way back, he finally got to fight again for the championship, which at that time was held by Joe Frazier.
Hmm.
And so then they had that series of
Frazier
fights,
versus Ali.
Frazier versus Ali, which I would say is the greatest competition in heavyweight boxing
Hmm.
ever. So Ali, I am giving my title of GOAT to. On the other hand, all goats have a dark side. And for me, Ali's dark side was his continued association with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because after Malcolm broke away from the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali sided with Elijah Muhammad against Malcolm, and Ali considered Malcolm to be a traitor. He therefore shed no tears when Malcolm was assassinated. Although I will say that Ali is my clear goat, I do have to put a asterisk next to his name because of his association with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah, I mean it's such an interesting piece of history, one that I think is still very intensely debated, certainly in the online spaces that I'm in, that like all of those political assassinations happening in the late 60s seems very clear that the US government played some sort of role, and the shooters were members of the Nation of Islam. But of course, you can, depending on your bias, sort of be like, well, were they plants of the FBI? Were they, individual actors who acted alone? No matter where you land on that, I would argue the climate that was created not as much by Elijah Muhammad, but by Farrakhan saying that Malcolm is a rat that is, worthy of being shot in the back or whatever, his house being bombed. Certainly, Malcolm himself, in the months leading up to his assassination, was saying, the nation is trying to kill me. He never said the government is trying to kill me. He was very clear that there was a huge issue with the Nation of Islam, this sort of cult of personality centered around the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And whether or not it was more the government or more the nation, clearly there was a huge for this group that's preaching, love and knowledge and understanding. Clearly, their rhetoric played a role in his assassination.
From the research that I have done, it is very clear that the killers of Malcolm came from a mosque in New Jersey, and that the killers were clearly directed by Elijah Muhammad. It is also true that the police were notably absent on the day
Right.
that Malcolm was killed. And so I cannot believe that there was not some kind of police collusion. As
Right.
a as a personal aside, you are aware of the fact that I grew up 3 blocks from where Malcolm was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom.
I could remember it was a ballroom. Yeah, the Audubon Ballroom.
Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. I want to read a quote.
Please.
This quote is from Kareem and from his first book. And here's what Kareem has to say. Malcolm X, who was a profound influence on me, had himself been guided by his faith in Islam. He had turned to the teaching of Elijah Muhammad with their burnt toast black people and white devil Caucasians while in prison. and had preached that racist demonology until he'd made his pilgrimage to Mecca. There, he'd found that true Islam had little to do with the mumbo jumbo that Elijah Poole had concocted. He discovered that in the center of the Muslim world, people from all over the earth congregated to live in peace and share as brothers their commonly held belief and faith in Allah. The criteria for being a good Muslim was not your color or your cultural heritage or how much money you had, but what you believed and what you practiced.
Hmm. And that is a good quote. And it makes me ask a question. If you have something you want to say before it, feel free. But as you just said, not only did you grow up in Harlem down the road from the Audubon Ballroom, but you grew up there at this time, of course, as well. And so surely as a black man in this area, regardless of your religious affiliation, there surely must have been pressure, that this wasn't just a religious group, but it was a cultural black brotherhood of men trying to, like Kareem just said, like sort of strengthen their relationship with Allah and each other and all of that. So did you feel pressure? Do you have any sort of regret for not changing your name or joining the Nation of Islam or becoming a Muslim in general? What's your background with that stuff?
So at the time, Malcolm and the Nation were viewed as extreme radicals. And
God
it
forbid.
was, yeah, and it was Malcolm versus King.
Right.
And so you were on one side of that divide or the other. And it often had to do with your class status. So if you were middle class, you tended to look down on Malcolm and were more on the King nonviolence side. But when I was growing up in Harlem, Muslims were everywhere. There were mosques all over the place. There were black men, members of the Nation, out selling the newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, and selling their famous bean pies. So I was always more of a Malcolm person than a King person. But one of the issues I did have with the Nation was the way in which women seemed to be subjugated
Mm.
and very strict roles for women and very strict roles, I mean, even for men as well. There was no drugs, no alcohol, no listening to jazz, for example.
Yeah.
Before Malcolm joined the Nation, he was a big jazz fan. And then after he joined the Nation, basically he couldn't listen to jazz anymore. I could not put myself totally into one camp or the other. I did prefer Malcolm on political issues, and I had trouble with the whole nonviolent thing of Dr. King. As somebody who had been very favorably disposed towards the Cuban Revolution, I could not just say all violence is wrong at all times. How can you say all violence is wrong at all times and then talk about World War II?
How can you understand kind of a level of indoctrination? Like, I can't imagine giving up my music taste for this club that I joined. I'd still be listening, if in his case, to Miles at my house or whatever. Like, that's a crazy thing. How do you grapple with that in your own brain?
I don't grapple with that in my own brain. I could not, to go back to one of your original questions, the answer is no. I never considered becoming a member of the Nation because it seemed to me to be too regulatory and I needed, freedom. I wasn't going to give up music to be a member of the nation and always walk around in bow ties and suits.
Right.
That just was not and is not my style.
Mm.
I was never, even though I was very much pro Malcolm, I never considered becoming a member of the nation.
And I think that brings me to a point about nuance that I think is so important because as a kid being removed from this, physically and with the time, it was like cool to like Malcolm more. It was like, oh, like Malcolm is the radical, King was like so Christian and a preacher, and so there was things to discount in that regard. But I think it's important to note one, Malcolm just said by any means necessary. It wasn't like actively calling for violence. He was the first to say, I don't want to use violence. It's only if they're using
Exactly.
violence against me. And King, despite having this nonviolent approach, was also extremely radical. His quotes about we read one on an episode about the full and immediate eradication of poverty. He wasn't just like, just because he was nonviolent doesn't mean that he didn't have really, really good views. And it's a bummer because he's gotten so whitewashed by our culture now, the Martin Luther King Day, where everyone recites the same, wanting black and white people to be equal and everybody, gives lip service to that. It's funny that people forget that he was assassinated too.
Also, remember that when he was assassinated, he was incredibly unpopular
Hmm,
in both the black world and the white world,
interesting. But he was working on a poor people's march that would have been, uniting people of all races to march
which
on
is which
Washington.
is which is why he got killed when he got killed.
Yeah.
It was okay, quote unquote, when he was just talking or seemed to be just talking about black folks. But when he stopped talking primarily about race and moved to talking about class and uniting poor black people and poor white people, that is when he became very dangerous to the powers that be. Because as we said earlier, race has been used as a tool to prevent people who have the same class interests from uniting. When King stopped talking about race and started talking about class, and when he came out against the Vietnam War in 1967, that made him even more dangerous, and that's why they took him out. And are we supposed to believe that James Earl Ray did that all by himself?
I certainly don't think so. Neither does, I can't remember the author's name, but the book is called An Act of State. And as someone who, as a child, could recite the cassette tape that I had that had some King speeches and was sort of like a children's auto or a children's biography of his. Yeah, they only talk about the James Earl Ray story. So it was really fascinating to read that book later in life to realize, oh, the story that I was told as a kid on this tape was not at all really what happened. However, this episode is not about Malcolm. This episode is not
Hmm.
about King or Elijah Muhammad. It's not really even entirely about Muhammad Ali. We are here to talk about goats.
This segment is not about Malcolm or King, et cetera, et cetera. All that was kind of an aside in the conversation about Muhammad Ali. Despite my difficulties with his decision to remain tied to Elijah Muhammad and therefore anti Malcolm, I will still say that Ali is the GOAT of heavyweight boxing.
I agree, but I think hopefully we'll be able to find a goat who better exemplifies what we want, but also at the same time, it comes back to capitalism. These people, it's hard to be critical of the system when it benefits you so well. So, of course, as we've touched on with Ali, he had these issues with the government and dealing with racism and stuff, but at the same time, he also became, very, very successful in his life um, and was clearly I can't get inside his brain and say he was indoctrinated, but certainly so devoted to the nation that he, because him and Malcolm were friends, and yet he turned his back on him because of Malcolm's, transformation.
So there was that famous meeting on the night before Ali fought Sonny Liston for the second time in Miami, and he and Malcolm were together.
We should move on to another sport because we got like five or six more at least, and then we can kind of see if there's a goat of all goats. The next sport we can get to, you talked a ton about not so much Ali, but Joe Louis and how he had to deal with the Great White Hope and like this whole actively racist campaign
No, no, no,
to
no, 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 no. The Great White Hope was was with Jack
Oh,
Johnson.
Jack Johnson, not Joe Louis. Sorry. But we have a similar story that I know a lot better about with baseball. And I don't know where you rank Jackie Robinson in your GOAT discussion, but he, of course, had the same kinds of things he had to deal with. And obviously wasn't the only person who had to deal with overt racism.
Do you know who my least favorite president ever was?
Well, certainly not Nixon.
Yes,
Certain.
Nixon.
Oh, I thought he was one of your favorites.
Jackie Robinson supported Nixon.
Oh, God. How?
So Jackie Robinson was a great baseball player, changed baseball because as the first black person in the major leagues, it led to the end of the Negro baseball leagues. And we have talked about this before, because of Jim Crow and segregation, there were all kinds of things that all kinds of parts of the white world that black people were not allowed to participate in. And as a result, black people had to invent structures for themselves to be able to survive. So you
Yeah.
had black barbershops, black funeral directors, black baseball leagues, etc., black grocery stores, etc., etc. And once Jim Crow, quote unquote, ended, all of that disappeared. So something was lost at the same time that something was gained. And it is great that recently baseball as an organization has started the process of including the records of black baseball players from the Negro Leagues into the overall baseball statistics.
Yeah.
Yes, so after he stopped playing, Jackie Robinson, he was a follower of Dr. King, but in the 70s he supported Nixon. And so I can't make him my baseball goat.
Fair
When
enough. And I think
people,
from stats are concerned too, there's some people who are quite above him
well,
as well.
well, in baseball, pretty much the biggest stat is how many home runs you hit.
Right.
Whether that is legitimate or not
Right.
is a separate question. So for many, 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 many years, the baseball goat was universally thought to be Babe Ruth.
Hmm.
And then when his home run record was eclipsed by Hank Aaron, theoretically that made Hank Aaron the GOAT. Lots of people were upset. Hank Aaron got all kinds of racist
Mm.
response because people didn't want a black person to pass Babe Ruth in the number of home runs.
Of course. Again, another sort of great white hope story.
Another great White Hope story. And then and then you had
Or
the
that's the great white goat story.
Great White Goat story. And then you had not only the total number of career home runs, you also had the highest number of home runs in a season.
Mm.
And then that got us into the steroid era where, Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, and then Roger Maris of the Yankees hit 61, but there was always a kind of asterisk next to Roger Maris's name because when Babe Ruth played, the season was 154 games, and when Maris played, it was 162 games.
Mm.
So Maris did not hit his 61st home run before the 154th game. And so people have always felt kind of weird about Roger Maris. But then when we
Sure.
got to the steroid age, you had, the three musketeers of steroids, Sammy Sosa, Mark McGuire, and Barry Bonds.
Hmm.
And they hit 70 home runs. And I think Barry Bonds hit 73. On the one hand, one could make an argument for Barry Bonds being the greatest of all time because of the number of home runs he hit. But
Hmm.
he, like McGuire and Sosa and your boy Roger Clemens, interestingly enough, none of them has been elected to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, they've been kind of
Pres-
like reserving judgment so far.
yeah, well, people have made a judgment by saying if you're known to have done steroids, then you should not be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting topic. I mean, if you look at pictures of Barry Bonds when he played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, when he was a great, great player,
Right.
and then you look at him when he was on the Giants, he's incredibly bulked
He
up.
became a giant.
He became a giant.
He was already a
Exactly.
big man, but
And of course, all those people have denied ever using steroids, but it's obviously clear that they did.
yeah,
And, you know, performance enhancing drugs is an interesting topic.
absolutely. And ones that aren't directly performance enhancing, if anyone can't guess, we both, enjoy marijuana from time to time. And, that's been one that Michael Phelps has gotten flack for, obviously in the NBA and the NFL, that players have gotten in trouble for using it as a, sleep aid or pain medication or something. It's not steroids that you're taking this thing that makes you stronger, faster, whatever. It's just something that enhances your performance because you're not in so much pain all the time. Then you can sleep at
Exactly.
night or whatever. So who is your
And
GOAT for
yeah,
baseball?
that's where I was going.
Good.
My goat. So I reject the notion that the baseball GOAT is the person who has hit the most career home runs. My definition of the GOAT is somebody who was skilled at multiple things that are necessary to be a great baseball player. Hit, hit with power, be able to run, be great in the field, as
Mm,
well as hit home runs. And so my baseball GOAT is the recently deceased Willie Mays.
mm. Not to
Of
be
course,
confused with Billy Mays, the OxyContin guy, who's
no,
also recently deceased.
not to be confused. And of course, I have a bias growing up in New York City. When I was a kid, New York had three baseball teams:
Wait a second.
the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Giants were all in New York at the
Right.
same time.
Forgot
And it
about
was a
that whole
very
Brooklyn Dodgers thing.
precisely, and it was very sad in the late 50s when both the Dodgers and the Giants left New York and went to California.
Is that why you went to California? You were chasing your baseball teams? So you said the
I
same
was
thing. You
not
said peace, New York.
I was no, that is not the reason. But I grew up, not only did I grow up blocks from where Malcolm was killed, I also grew up blocks from the polo grounds
Mm.
where the Giants and Willie Mays played. So Willie Mays will always be my goat.
Well, I would argue with you but I think baseball is like the most boring sport. The only time I've enjoyed baseball was because my Nana enjoyed baseball, and there's, the Red Sox, and the pride around the Red Sox is kind of a cool thing. And before they won the World Series, there was no Matt doing his thing. Or was he still on the team? I think he was done already. I don't remember. Again, baseball. But that team that did win, whether or not, I'm pretty sure he was done. But like, Big Poppy and Manny Ramirez and Johnny Damon with hair before he cut it off and became a Yankee. But that team was a cool team. They broke the curse, which whatever the fuck that is. That I liked baseball. I obviously couldn't say that any of those were the greatest baseball players of all time, but that watching baseball then was a bit exciting for me, but I haven't missed it since I stopped watching it, whatever, 12 years
I
ago.
cannot watch baseball either. It's incredibly boring because there's so much time in between plays. I do think it is a good thing that they instituted a pitch clock.
Right.
I will say, however, one of the interesting things about baseball right now is Shohei Ohtani,
Absolutely.
who recently, I think it was, yeah, what he did yesterday was ridiculous.
What did he do yesterday? 'Cause I've heard about him the last few months, but not yesterday.
Yes,
Crazy.
yeah, yesterday he was playing Miami. He came up 6 times. He got 6 hits. He hit 3 home runs. He stole 2 bases, and he had 10 RBIs. And those home runs and stolen bases made him the first person in the history of baseball to have 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases in the same season.
Which is super cool. Also, it's kind of just like, man, Miami must be dog shit if they were getting beat so bad that a hitter
Oh,
was able to hit 6 times.
Miami is terrible as a baseball team.
Clearly, like you shouldn't, part of that is of course amazing, and I don't want to downplay what he did, but you usually don't bat more than 4 times in a game. So clearly
Correct.
they were getting beat badly in order for that to
Yes.
happen.
Yes. I think the final score was something like 20-2.
Yeah, that's rough. All right,
So,
well, baseball's boring.
yes.
We'll give you Willie, not Billy Mays. We got a couple other sort of boring ones, or at least one, but honorable mention hockey, soccer on ice. It's a cool sport for sure. There's nobody who, at least yet, has surpassed the great Wayne, namesake of one of our favorite artists, but Wayne Gretzky in this case for hockey.
I would say in all of sports, that is the one sport where there's no conversation to be had. That is why he is called the Great One.
Yeah,
Nobody will ever surpass what he did. Goal scores, assists, number of Stanley Cups won in Edmonton. He is the GOAT.
yeah, exactly. Cool. Moving on.
That was the easy one.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I'm not Canadian, so hockey. I mean, it's cool, but yeah, anyway, no conversation. This one, I think there's certainly a conversation to be had, though this comes back to what we were saying about Muhammad Ali and how we would love for a GOAT to be someone who is exemplary and does things in their community and is political. But unfortunately, in the sport of tennis, in the last couple of years, we have had, and we've already talked about Novak because we were talking about political protests and stuff. So anyway, Novak Djokovic, I've looked at the stats. I've stared at it as many times as I could. I have a friend who's a huge tennis fan. I was like, isn't there any way that we can say somebody else? But unfortunately, you can't. Novak Djokovic is the male GOAT in tennis, as much as we don't like it.
Disagree.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
There's a similarity between baseball and tennis in that in baseball, people tend to look at the one stat of how many career home runs you have. Similar thing happens in tennis. How many Grand Slams have you won? That is a more complicated topic than it might at first appear. And there are 2 issues in particular that I would like to bring up. The first is that for many years, the Australian Open was not considered to be really a part of the Grand Slams. People didn't want to travel that far to play. So a lot of times the biggest names in tennis did not play in the Australian Open. Many people, when people count Grand Slams, among women, for example, the name at the top of the list is Margaret Court, who
That
was
miserable bitch.
homophobic and everything.
Exactly.
But because she was Australian, she always played in the Australian Open.
Of
So,
course. She's from the
so
land down under. How could you not play
exactly.
at it?
So many of her 24 Grand Slams are from the Australian Open. I think that counting Grand Slam titles is not necessarily the best way to judge tennis players. The second factor is that until, I don't remember the exact year, 1968-ish, before that, tennis was divided in two. There were people who were professional tennis players and people who were amateurs, in the same way as happened in the Olympics, where only amateurs could participate. The same was true in tennis. And so people who were professional tennis players were not allowed to play at Wimbledon or the US Open.
Interesting.
A person I would suggest, what is considered to be the greatest achievement in tennis? And I would say the greatest achievement in tennis is winning the Grand Slam, winning
Yes.
all four major tournaments: Australia, Wimbledon, French Open, US Open, winning all four of them in 1 year.
Right. The tour, what do they call it? I don't know. I think there's a fancy name that they call it, the Grand Slam. Yeah,
They
I can't
call it a
remember.
calendar Grand Slam
Calendar
because they,
Slam. Okay.
yeah, because they made up a second term called the Serena Slam
Right, right.
because she won all four in a row, but not in the same calendar year.
Right, because she started with the US Open, which is at the end of the year, and then
Correct.
came back around, but then lost the US Open that whatever year it
Correct.
was, 2016
Whatever
or
year,
something. Yeah.
whatever. So for me, the greatest achievement in tennis is to win all four in 1 year. I believe only two people have done that: Steffi Graf and Rod Laver. And
Okay.
Rod Laver did it twice.
And wait, and what was the status of, because I know he's not young, because I only know his name as a distant person. What was the status with the Australian Open? Was it fully integrated at that point, or was it still kind of
He's
an
Australian.
easier one? Oh, well then isn't that part of your Margaret Court argument that he did it when the Australian Open wasn't up to snuff?
No, he did it after they changed the
Gotcha. Okay.
rules and allowed professionals to play.
Got it. Okay.
So there are a whole bunch of great tennis players, including a lot of them Australian. Rod Laver, Fred Stolle, John Newcomb had all turned professional. So that's why they refer to it as the open era
Hmm.
in tennis. So the open era was when professionals were allowed to play in those tournaments. And so it was after they allowed that that Rod Laver won the Grand Slam twice.
Got it. Man.
So for me, it is hard not to think of Rod Laver as the male tennis GOAT. And he would have won many more Grand Slam tournaments if they had not had the ban on professionals.
Well, as I said at the beginning of this, because I didn't realize you were gonna, again, I did my research. I was talking to people because he did that, but he still only won, and you made a point of why he did, but I think it's only whatever, like a dozen or something. Like those two calendar slams he did, he didn't win all that many other slams after that compared to the Joker, who has tons. But like I said, I just needed an excuse to shit on Djokovic. So I will say, yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
I will concede that argument. But move on because we got a couple more sports to get to and not tons of time. Like baseball, I feel like American football has gotten increasingly boring. These commercial breaks and the long plays. College football, by contrast, just feels like it goes so quick and it's exciting, but the NFL, I feel like, is turning into WWE more and more. However, I feel like well, I'm curious. I think there's a pretty clear GOAT in this category, even though he's one of my least favorite football players, but he's very talented. But let's hear what you have to say if you got a different opinion about who the GOAT may not be.
Well, the obvious answer is Tom Brady.
Exactly.
But as with other sports, GOAT status often has to do with numbers. And in
Hmm?
Tom Brady's case, it's how many Super Bowls you have won. Talking about one's importance off the field, I'm going to nominate somebody other than Tom Brady,
Love it.
and that person would be Jim Brown.
Mm. Who I think has pretty solid numbers too. He's not no.
He has solid numbers,
Yeah.
and certainly before Tom Brady came along, I think almost everybody would have said that Jim Brown was the greatest football player
Okay. Do you
ever.
remember how many Super Bowls he has?
It was before there were Super
Oh shoot,
Bowls.
it's that old school. God damn it. Well then there you go. Yeah, it was whatever American Football Conference stuff or whatever it was back then. AFL, American Football League. That's what it was.
Yes,
Uh,
there was just the NFL, and then there was the AFL. They were two separate leagues, never played each
exactly.
other.
Right.
Then they had the merger, and then you had the NFC and the AFC.
All right. Well, a couple of things that get me on this, which I haven't brought up at all, but it's now two sports in a row. Sort of three, though I didn't care about baseball, so we didn't keep going. But now for tennis and football, you have entered people, and I think this is as we get closer to the two sports we both care about the most. I think this is an important thing to at least pose to you, which is the level of talent has increased significantly as time has gone on. So don't you think there's a bit of an argument to be made in terms of who you're competing against? That Tom Brady was able to be so dominant, that Novak Djokovic was able to be so dominant in the modern day compared to these guys who were playing when, you know, just the level of competition, just the level of, even if you speak to like competition between the players, just the facilities and equipment and like the advances in medicine we've been able to have to like, breed athletes who are just these corn-fed men 18 to 25 who are just these monsters who are linemen and linebackers and all of that stuff. So anyway, your thoughts on that for either or both sports?
I agree. There are things that you have access to now as an athlete that you didn't have access to before. Trainers and whatever facilities you can make use of. That obviously makes it easier for one to play longer. And so for a tennis player, Djokovic is relatively old.
Right.
And so, I mean, and he just won the Olympics and he had just come off of surgery.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can recover from a major Achilles problem as soon as he did speaks to the wonders of modern medicine. And people who played in earlier generations didn't have access to that. And none of the people I have mentioned was my favorite tennis player.
Fair. Yeah. There's certainly, like we did honorable mentions. Yeah. I mean, well, we touched Steffi Graf. I mean, my goat, which is because it's too biased by being a favorite, but also because she's incredible and so dominant, is Serena. I definitely am giving Serena my tennis goat. Do you have oh, I know you do. So who is your favorite and honorable mention tennis goat? I think it's on the female side. Well, you probably have some on the men because Rod Laver is probably not your favorite tennis player.
My favorite male tennis player was Bjorn Borg.
Hmm.
who retired at the age of 26.
Interesting. Almost could have made this 27 club.
Almost. In terms of women's tennis, I would say there are three people to talk about, or maybe four. There's Serena, there's Martina, there's Chris Evert,
Hmm.
and there's Billie Jean King.
That's four people, but that's okay.
I thought I said four.
I thought you said three. Maybe
No,
I'm tripping.
whatever.
So who out of those four, who gets your favorite, who gets your best out of those four? Or your GOAT? You still haven't quite said if it was officially, you mentioned Steffi Graf, but you didn't necessarily say if it's we didn't finish up
So
the women
we did not.
conversation.
My favorite was Martina.
Mm,
I would really have liked to have seen Martina and Serena play each other in their prime.
yeah.
I think that would have been really interesting and exciting. But I'm going to give my goat to Billie Jean
Mm.
because not only was she a great tennis player, but all the
She was also
things
not your lover.
she was not my lover. All the things that Billie Jean has done for women after her tennis career was over, she is responsible, pretty much solely responsible for women tennis players getting the same amount of money as
Mm.
men tennis players.
Yeah, that's big.
And think about the fact that the complex at the US Open, the whole complex is named after her.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would give my goat to Billie Jean.
I
I
like that.
think that in their primes, I think Serena and Martina would probably have beaten her.
Mm.
But because of her extracurricular activities, I'm going to give my goat to Billie Jean.
I love it. All right. We've left tennis and came back, but we got to get to the big ones. Starting with footy, and not pigskin footy, but soccer. Certainly my favorite sport. I don't know if you teeter. What is your favorite sport?
Probably basketball, but
That's what I thought.
but but soccer is second.
And my memories of being, I think more like 96 World Cup, being like a baby, 3, 4 years old, up at 4 in the morning with you and my brothers, going crazy for famous Brazilian soccer players going crazy. But
I still do that.
of course,
I watch every match of the World Cup, no
me
matter
too.
what time of day or night it is.
Honestly, when my life starts and stops with like when the World Cup is happening, and it's sort of like I mentally go into happiness hibernation. Like this is my not World Cup happiness, but man, when the World Cup is happening, it's so special. And we'll talk about specific World Cups, I'm sure, as we continue the show, because there's tons to talk about politically, capitalistically, etc. However, as cool as he is, and this is why I started to set this up before, when we were talking about tennis, as cool as the great Pele is, totally changed the game, juggling and dribbling, like these, integral skills to the game came about with him. It doesn't make him the GOAT because we have the flea. He's just so incredible. And I loved soccer so much before Messi came into the world. And then to see this tiny little man who's tiny because of some like autoimmune disease, that's another interesting capitalist story of, Messi, no one would know Messi's name had he grown up somewhere else, or had Barcelona not found him and paid for all of his surgeries because they saw how good of a soccer player he was. But anyway, and I have it here, 840 goals compared to it's weird because Pele has anywhere between 700 and like 7,000, because they just didn't keep stats quite the same way. And some of the games they say he doesn't count because they weren't really full professional games. But the number I found, the sort of official one, is 762 for him and 840 for Messi. And it's not just about goals. He has more World Cups. Pele played four World Cups and won three. Messi played five and just got his first. And there's all sorts of pretty boy fans out there who say that Argentina got, calls and stuff in order to win it, which I don't agree with. I think those are just messy haters. But it's messy. It's messy. Say whatever you want, but it's messy.
Back in the day, there was a cool poster. I used to have it hanging on my wall someplace and got lost in moves. Was a picture of, I think the number was 5 black pearls. And that was it.
Wait, so didn't it
Pele.
just look like a what's a? It's not an ellipse. What's the dot dot dot? Like the end of sentence.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's exactly what it looked like. So my argument is there's no question. It's Pele. He,
Yeah.
you know, you are right about the counting is messed up when it comes to him. And so it's really hard to compare. But for me, there's no question that it's Pele. He changed the way the game was played. He was, I believe, 17 in his first World Cup, completely changed the way the game is played.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
for me, there's no question.
All
Pele
right.
is the man.
It's tough. And as long as, and just to because there's people out there who say it's the pretty boy, and I did the looking. When you cut out penalty kicks, which is why he's able to have recently reached 900 goals, Messi has 723 and Ronaldo has 721. Cristiano Ronaldo, not to be confused with the real Ronaldo there as well. So,
Exactly.
so any brain dead person who thinks the pretty boy is the GOAT, you're wrong. He only has a lot of goals because of penalty kicks, which are notoriously easy to score. Yes, I mean sometimes people mess up. Messi is not a great penalty kick taker, which is funny, but it's not a goal. It's not the same thing. Free kicks, of course, I'll give you that. The way, and I think Ronaldo has a few more than Messi there. The way you bend the ball and get it over the wall. You know, Another Brazilian pioneer, Roberto Carlos, who totally changed how you hit the ball in order to get that swerve and make it fly into the corner. Yeah, we can agree to disagree. And I mean, I hear your arguments. I'd still say Pele changed the game, but even if he hadn't, you go look, it's like he was playing against all these white boys who had no idea they didn't know how to dribble. All they did was pass. And so he just walk up and take the ball and dribble around 10 people and score.
Yeah, but
It was so easy.
he knew how to dance with the ball.
So does Messi. The Messi is crazy because
But
people
Messi, maybe it's because he's short. Messi to me never looks grateful.
like grateful of how good he is.
No, graceful.
Oh, graceful. That's because people are trying to kill him every 2 seconds. But
Yeah,
it's
but
like,
if you watch his stride, he takes little tiny steps. He takes like 10 steps to Pele's 3 steps.
mhm.
And to me, when he's on the pitch, he does not look as graceful as Pele.
Yeah, I'll give you that. It's
Also,
not it's
another
not
thing,
ballet though. If we're talking about grace, then Ronaldinho is the GOAT for life.
well, you could say that too. There are many more goals scored in soccer now than used to be the case. When
True.
Pele played, the average score was 1-0.
Mm.
And when you think about that and then look at how many goals he scored,
Okay.
I would say he's way beyond everybody.
I'll give you that. And I don't know, I'm sure there's a number of reasons for that. I know one of them is that posts used to be pointy. Now they're rounded where you can hit the post and it can go in fairly
Exactly.
easily. But then it was if you hit the posts, it was going out most of the time. So that's a huge change. In the interest of time, we can agree to disagree, and I hear your arguments. You know, I don't flat out reject them. But we're at the final stop of this GOAT tour. I have to start with an honorable mention because I'm, of course, wearing the honorable Hakeem Olajuwon's jersey. 13th in points all time. So it's a fair honorable mention. Certainly not the GOAT, but a great player. And this was my brother D's jersey. And it has, when he was a child. Like this jersey is dummy old, and so it's always, I don't wear it very much, but it's nice to have a reason to wear it and to think about Hakeem the Dream. Talking about graceful, you don't have many 7-footers who can move like that. He had a lot of grace to him, to his style
Uh,
of play, and scored a ton of points.
I would agree with all of that, but he's not.
Uh,
But he's not the GOAT.
he's not the GOAT. And I know that we have different GOATs for this one. Would you like to start, or would you like me to start?
I'm happy to start.
Let's hear it.
So these days, when people talk about who is the GOAT in basketball, there are only two people who ever get mentioned, and that's Michael Jordan and LeBron James. Between those two people, I would say there's absolutely no contest that
Agreed.
it's Michael Jordan. Look at what would be their claims to fame. Michael Jordan was in 6 NBA finals. He won all 6. None of them even went to a 7th game. And he was the most valuable player in all 6 of them. And he had 2 three-peats. He could have had an 8-peat if he hadn't taken off 2 years to play baseball.
Right. We talked about Muhammad Ali being, and granted, his was self-imposed, but still, yeah, that was a big, in his prime, taking 2 years off. And is that who won those two when he was gone?
Yeah, yeah, I know.
So thank you, Mikey, because that helps that helps Hakeem's career out.
Yeah, that's the only reason that Houston won.
Exactly.
And remember that one of those years, Houston was in the finals against the Knicks, and they interrupted the game to show the OJ Bronco chase.
Oh shit. I did not know they did that. I thought you were gonna make something about the Knicks. Wow, that's crazy.
Totally crazy.
Weird. All right,
So,
so you said out of Mikey and LeBron, it's Mikey. Duh. Um,
LeBron, I want to say two other things about LeBron, or two things about LeBron. No, LeBron was in more finals, but he lost a lot of them.
right.
And at least one of the ones he won has a huge asterisk next to it. The one against Golden State when Golden State was up 3 games to 1 and Draymond got kicked out. That's the only reason that LeBron won that one.
Sure, but Draymond is also one of the dirtiest players in NBA history, which is saying a lot.
Well, maybe one of, but I can think of people. Bill
Of course.
Lambier, Bill Lambier,
Of course, but it
or that
also
or that
back when
whole Detroit team.
I was gonna say, yeah, because it wasn't just him, but that it was more or less allowed and understood to be a thing then, that all of these teams, that Rodman and yeah, that whole Detroit team,
John
DeMarcus,
Sally.
yeah,
Yeah,
would all do that, but everybody knew that, and now it's the game. Draymond kicks people in the nuts, like
he
on
does.
purpose.
He
Like
does. He
that's
does. He does. He does. But also, speaking of goatness,
Mhm.
the game is easier now than it was when Mikey played. It
Right,
was
which is
much
rare for most sports, but that is true. I would agree.
exactly. So it was much tougher for him to be as successful as he was than it is for LeBron.
Which is why Mikey's the GOAT. Conversation over, right?
Not quite. So I'm going to suggest someone else as my GOAT. One of LeBron's claims to fame is that he has scored the most number of points in NBA history. And the person he surpassed was Kareem. And it's important to remember that Kareem went to college for 4 years and LeBron did not go to college. So LeBron had 4 more years to play and score points than Kareem did. So if
In
you
his
take
prime, because
in
you have to say that because as of today, Kareem has still played many more NBA games than LeBron has. LeBron has done it in much fewer games, but the point is that he was younger and in his physical prime during
Exactly.
those. Yeah,
So I would say if you take Kareem's scoring average and
24.6 points per game.
so if you add that times four and add all those points, he would be LeBron would have to play for 6 more years
Right.
to catch Kareem.
He might. Who knows? Now that Bronny's coming into the league, you never know.
You never know.
We both might be eating all these words. LeBron might come in to do like a Tom Brady thing and become this old man who's still, it's like, how is he still playing? How is he still winning? I don't think that that will happen, but it is possible. So Kareem, all right. So it's Kareem and Mikey. I don't think the stats look good for you, Dad. I don't think so.
Michael Jordan was great, but one of the parts of this conversation was about not just what the person did on the court, but what they did off the court.
Do we have to talk about that?
Yeah, we do have to talk about that.
Yeah, because Michael Jordan is a piece of shit, straight up.
Well,
He's
let's remember his most famous quote when Harvey Gantt and Jesse Helms were running for the Senate in Mikey's home state of North Carolina.
Can we call him Jay Helms or something, or Mr. Helms or
Oh,
Senator Helms?
fine, fine. Michael Jordan refused to take any political stance and said something to the effect that Republicans buy sneakers too.
That's
And
exactly what he said.
that's all he cared about. So his off the court activities limit him, in my estimation. For Kareem changed the game. He invented a shot that to this day nobody can duplicate except for that one little time with Magic's baby hook. He completely changed the game. He invented a shot that was completely unstoppable.
Right.
Nobody
Well,
could stop the sky hook.
yes. And
And
part
then,
of Hakeem's huge success as well. And even, I mean, not as much, but even like Karl Malone had a hook he busted out every so often too.
yeah,
Another huge,
Karl Malone was not bad.
yeah.
I mean, he delivered the mail
And he's right under Kareem in points currently.
precisely, precisely. So there is all of the social activism that Kareem has been engaged with. You may not know this. Kareem, and when we get to our quote, I'm going to read a quote from Kareem. Kareem refused to play in the 1968 Olympics
Mm,
for political reasons.
badass.
Kareem has written a bunch of books on history.
I didn't realize I've I haven't read any of his books, and I clearly need to because the quote you read earlier about Malcolm, like it's not easy to write about someone as, important as Malcolm, and so many people have done it. But yeah, I want to hear that quote again because he's clearly a very good writer as well, too.
He's a very good writer. I mean, Kareem, I have followed Kareem since I was in high school
Mm.
because Kareem and I were in high school at the same time.
I was gonna say you're like basically the same age, I'm pretty sure.
He's 3 years older.
Okay.
So when I was a freshman in high school, he
He was a
was
senior.
in high school. But
Yeah.
Kareem and I have so much in common. Both lived in Harlem, both went to Catholic school, both went to college in California, both moved back east, both moved back west, both very political, and both gigantic jazz fans.
Mm. I
So,
assume you're talking about Utah.
Utah.
Yeah, Utah Jazz, right?
Well, you know the story of the Utah Jazz.
Well, yeah, it's one of the big reasons Mikey, despite politically having virtually nothing, and the one caveat I would say to that, because as you know, I don't believe in free will, and I think that circumstance and environment are very important in this discussion. Mikey was sort of the first like athlete that was so insanely popular. He had a lot of, you talked about how difficult it was to be in the league then. it just seemed like it's hard for him just to be a human, that anywhere he went, and he was an athlete. He wasn't the other Mikey who built a career on being like a character and a performer. This dude's just trying to play fucking basketball, and now he can't go anywhere without thousands and thousands of people, or being so good that when you went to fucking Utah for the finals, you ate some pizza and all of a sudden got the flu and had to overcome and play games on the road. You know, that stadium full of white people screaming and booing at you. You're sick as fuck and still put up
The
insane numbers and
insane
put the
numbers.
team on his back.
He did. I was going to say something about the name, the Utah Jazz.
Right.
I assume you know that originally it was the New Orleans Jazz,
Yes.
and they moved to Utah and kept the name Jazz.
The movie Basketball that the South Park guys, Trey Parker and Matt Stone made, have a little section about that, and they talk about all the teams that moves, the Dodgers that we talked about earlier, and the line is, and the New Orleans Jazz moved to Utah where they don't allow music.
Exactly. Which is why the New Orleans team is now the Pelicans, because
Yes.
when they came into the league, they tried to negotiate with Utah, and Utah refused.
Which is just, yeah, classic Utah.
Which is why we also have the Memphis Grizzlies, because they
And
were originally the Vancouver
and
Grizzlies.
the Los Angeles Lakers where there are no lakes.
They were the Minneapolis Lakers.
Exactly, which, makes sense.
Minnesota's on their license plate, the land of 10,000 lakes.
Exactly. Yeah, that's not California. Speaking of California, we can't have a basketball goat conversation without, I won't be able to leave my home safely without at least mentioning that though he is not in the conversation for the goat, a lot of people love Kobe and wish that he was the goat, but he is not. But he was a pretty decent human, other than some things. He was a pretty
Yeah,
decent human in some areas, and
yes,
and a rapist in others.
exactly.
But he was also a very very good basketball player.
He was a very good basketball player, and I remember seeing his very last game, and he scored 55 points.
Right,
And everybody knew it was his last game, and
right,
he was amazing and a pretty intelligent dude.
yeah.
He grew up in Italy and spoke Italian fluently,
He's a huge
and
soccer guy, which is also like he
he's a
was.
huge soccer guy, and yeah, very very interesting. But
He's a cultural icon, and it's devastating that he not only died young, but died, of course, tragically with, his daughter as
with
well.
his
And
daughter, right?
because it would have been interesting to see how he maybe eventually spoke to the allegation and stuff and whatever, and just kind of the man he would have become. I would have loved to still have him in the world, getting old and contributing to the sport and the world. Very, very sad loss.
Very sad loss.
I am okay giving you, we talked at the beginning of talking about like a goat of goats. And I can certainly, because of the social points, give you Kareem, but you need to know some numbers. Kareem played 20 seasons to Mikey's 15. 5 more years in the league. They both got 6 rings. As you already touched on, Mikey got finals MVP every single finals he was in. Kareem only got it twice. Kareem was the MVP 6 times to Mikey's 5, so you do get that one. Points per game. We already said Kareem 24.6, Mikey 30.1 points per game. Pretty pretty incredible. And the points total, we've already talked about that. It is technically LeBron in and much, not much, but 68 fewer games. He's already about 2,000, more than 2,000 points ahead of Kareem. Mikey is only fifth. He's behind Kobe, Karl Malone, Kareem, and LeBron. So if you're talking about a points thing, maybe. But Kareem has played 500 more games than Mikey as well. So obviously he's going to have a one up in points, and only 6,000, so 30 that's some math we're going to have to do. 30 times 80 is like 240 a season, 5 more seasons. It's like 1,000. So, okay. So even if we do like a quick projection, Kareem would still have him on points. Those rings and how he did it and how difficult the league was, his points per game. I still think from a stats basketball only perspective, Mikey still has to be my GOAT, but you have taught me a lot about Kareem today. I have a lot more respect and adoration than I did previously, and his stats are good. His stats are good, but I can't say that he's the
Mm. But
GOAT.
I would also say one of the quote unquote limitations of Kareem, I would say Kareem had a better supporting cast.
Mm-hmm.
Mikey kind of had to do it by himself. He didn't win a ring until Scotty joined.
Don't forget Steve Kerr.
Really.
I just love
Um,
that story about him where it's like the buzzer beater he hit, and it's like we got in the huddle. And it's like, all right, guys, and Phil Jackson's like, all right, we got to get it to Steve.
I know, really surprising. Um,
He's a funny guy.
yeah, but Kareem had magic.
Exactly.
And so it wasn't possible for Kareem to win every MVP because he had magic.
But it also
Scotty was never going to win an MVP.
exactly, which begs the question,
Not to mention James Worthy.
Would Kareem have gotten 6 rings without, this incredible team?
I think that Laker team was probably the greatest team of all
It's
time.
a really good team.
I mean, Kareem and Magic and James Worthy.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see them play some of the modern teams now. I mean, I think about particularly Golden State. If Golden State had even like a halfway decent center any of those years, I mean, who was
They
the
have
best one? Andrew Bogut was like,
exactly. They've never had a great center.
and if they had, that team would easily be the greatest team of all time. They're still in the conversation just from how insane their shooting is.
Exactly.
Splash
Exactly.
Brothers.
Splash Brothers. No, no more Splash Brothers.
No. Any final thoughts?
No, I'm sticking with Kareem and I'm sticking with Billie Jean.
All right. Well, before we shot this that I heard your arguments about Kareem and you've added more stuff today as well. So I'm okay, especially for the political stuff, surrendering in that sense. But for now, it has come to be that time. I hope that you have learned a thing or two. And if you didn't smile once during this episode, then this is not the show for you. In the words of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Father, please take it away.
So, as I said earlier, in 1968, Kareem refused to play on the U.S. Olympic team. That was the Olympics in Mexico City. And this is what he said. There was an attempt, it didn't work. There was an attempt to have an organized boycott of black athletes in all sports to not participate in the Olympics that year. Because as we talked about earlier, there was a massacre of students by the Mexican government right before the Olympics took
We
place in
actually
Mexico City.
we actually didn't talk about that on the show. We talked about that yesterday
Oh,
personally. You should dedicate maybe a few seconds talking about that because that I didn't know about that. That's horrific.
so in 1968, the Olympics were in Mexico City. They were in October, which is unusual for the Olympics because of the heat.
Mm.
And there was massive student protests, anti-government stuff going on. And Mexico, I believe this was the first time that the Olympics had taken place in Latin America. And so Mexico wanted things to go as smoothly and prettily as possible. I also think this was the first time that the entire Olympics was televised.
Mm. Okay.
And so it was a gigantic deal.
Yeah.
So students were protesting in massive numbers in a big square in the middle of the city. And the government sent in the police and they just shot hundreds of students. And in the middle of the night, got rid of the bodies, cleaned up all the blood, etc., etc. And
Fucking crazy.
it was terrible, terrible, terrible. So this is from Kareem's first book. The meeting reached no final resolution, and no formal boycott was announced or carried out. I fully supported the idea. I felt no part of the country and had no desire to help it look good. I had better things to do. Playing in the Olympics would have meant losing a full quarter's worth of classes and not graduating from UCLA on time, and I had no intention of disrupting my education so that a country that was abusing my people could be made to shine for the world. Think about that compared to I'll read one more little passage. I was
Please.
fearly, I was fairly proud of John Carlos and Tommy Smith when they made their black-gloved victory stand power salute. My passive gesture had cost me a lot. I was deluged by hate mail, calling me an uppity nigger and a traitor, and I knew their active statement in the public eye of that hurricane would cost them much more. I think of them as patriots. Kareem is my homeboy. Kareem is my goat of goats. And that was from Kareem's first book, which is entitled Giant Steps, after the John Coltrane song. And so that is our song of the day, Giant Steps by John Coltrane.
Love it. Well, this has been Radicals with Age. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you after a while.